Okay, so we're in the last days of conversations with Yogananda. Several people, I've been getting emails, some people have asked me just to start over, but I don't think I will. But I think I pretty much decided to do Swami's book of letters in divine friendship, which will probably take me the rest of my life, because I think it's fatter than this. Those letters are, not only are they insightful and good, I mean, they were culled from 25 or 30 years of correspondence, but also because of the fact that Swami was always writing to someone specifically. They have a certain immediacy about them that is quite different from other of his writings. So they're really marvelous. It was a brilliant idea. It had never occurred to me. Someone else suggested it. So anyway, so now we don't have to keep stretching this to last forever, because we're okay. We'll be fine. So now we're on number 446. A young Hindu had come to America for a year of study at a university. During the ship crossing, he saw in meditation a vision of Paramhansa Yogananda, of whom he had never before heard. He happened to meet the master several months later and recognized him from the vision, meaning he didn't meet him deliberately, he happened to meet him. And then when he saw Master, he realized he had already seen him in the vision coming over in the ship. The man had no idea who he'd seen in the vision. This young man had a guru of his own in India. Devi Mukherjee, to whom I've referred earlier, who was a fellow monk at SRF, who was a man from Calcutta, became friends with this young man and asked the master why the youth had been vouchsafed such a vision, since he already had a guru of his own. It is an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, it wasn't solicited. It wasn't like he was tuning into Master because he already knew him. He was just traveling across the ocean, and all of a sudden a vision of Master comes to him. The Master replied, that was because this is a special dispensation of God. Now this, what he's referring to is his incarnation and the work that Master brought. I'll talk about that in a moment. He often called his work a special dispensation. He said that the reason that this man had this vision, even though I'm not his guru and he has a guru, is because this mission, and therefore this incarnation, is a special dispensation of God. There was no special significance in the vision in terms of the young man's destiny. It didn't mean, for example, that the young man was being told to convert to the Master's teachings. This story, Swami writes, has helped me to understand that the mission of an avatar especially is to bring a new wave of consciousness into the world, and not only to provide a few people with an example of his own inspiring life. Indeed, I saw in Master repeatedly this vast breadth of vision. Often he insisted to us, we are not a sect. And of himself he said, as I quoted earlier, gazing blissfully into my eyes, the Master said, just a bulge of the ocean, referring to himself, Master's own consciousness, just a bulge of the ocean. He urged us to be loyal to the path to which God had drawn us, but he never urged us to be bigoted, quite to the contrary. When you see any form of God in vision, Master said, behold in those eyes the consciousness of infinity. It is a mistake to limit God to any form, to any definition, to any one religion. My goodness, there's a lot in this, of a much more esoteric, and not esoteric in the way that just sinks me when I have to go into states of consciousness I don't know anything about, but esoteric from the point of view of just really grasping what it is that an avatar is and what an avatar comes to do. And the timing of this recording is March 2020, and January 2020, as I've said earlier in these recordings, I spent in Israel being one of the leaders of 2 different pilgrimage groups, which was my 3rd trip to Israel in a little over a year. So I've gotten really deep into the story of the incarnation of Christ and not from an academic point of view, but some sense of the history and how these things take place. And Jesus' teaching, Christianity, is so firmly established in our world today, and the outlines of the story are so familiar to certainly to all of us Westerners, that it's easy to forget what the actual day-to-day experience was and how long it took for the global credibility, which we just take for granted, to manifest itself. And, when Jesus died, only a few of his disciples had the courage to be at the cross with him, and there had been 12 apostles. 12 apostles. What a funny word. 12 apostles. And 12 apostles, and one of them was Judas, and so Judas disqualified himself and then killed himself. So there were actually only 11, and they had to add one. They added another one back. They voted on who to take in as the 12. But that was really, then they gathered very small groups of people. Then, for a long time, all the powers of the world, whether they were religious or secular, tried to obliterate them completely. Just persecuted them and tortured them and killed them and fed them to lions and denigrated them and ostracized them. And then eventually it took over the world. Let's see, how did Gandhi put it? Gandhi was talking, Mahatma Gandhi, when he was trying to liberate India. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. At first they don't take you seriously at all, and then they think you're a joke. First they don't even see you. Then they think you're a joke. Then they start to fight with you, and then in the end you triumph. And it's sort of like when something of real, lasting cosmic value comes up, almost by definition, it has to be for the future. Meaning it has to, if it has a long-lasting value, it has to be in tune with more than the moment. I mean, now, Jesus's was the Yuga was falling still. The nadir of Kali Yuga was 500 AD. So for 5 centuries after the life of Jesus, the consciousness of the planet and the circumstances of the planet just got worse and worse and worse. It's really hard to put your mind around that, which is why the Christians didn't build anything, why they just went off into caves and into monasteries. They just really separated themselves from society because society was going into a state of disintegration. And in 500 AD, as I understand it from what I've read about the Yugas, the barbarians just swept through. They were just unleashed and they just swept through. So there was no point in having built anything because it wasn't going to last. But they were planting vibrationally, very, very deeply, very, very deep seeds, so that when all that was over and it began to turn, the refined civilization was literally in the monasteries, and it began to come up. And then later in 1100 around, when Sri Yukteswar was Lanfranc with William, he started the Cluny Monastery with 12 monks. At a time when the there was as much corruption in the monastic life as there was saintliness. And he started a pure, true monastery with 12 monks, and over the next 200 years, as I understand it, completely rescued the church, and then recreated art and science and literature and architecture, many other things, starting with 12 monks who were really in tune with it. And there were just 12 monks over here. They were nobody as far as the world was concerned, but they were commissioned by God to be the instruments of a divine flow of energy that needed to come into the world. You've heard me say before that when Swami was introduced to Michael Jackson by the teenagers in our community, he'd never heard of him. That was when Michael was at the height of his power, before he was discredited. Swami was honest enough to recognize that, as he put it, Michael was a consummate artist. He said he was absolutely clear about what he wanted to say, and he said it to perfection. And what he said was was absolutely in tune with the times, which is why he was such a global phenomenon. You know, music is vibration, and vibration is a state of consciousness. And he was the vibration of the consciousness of the planet. So all over the planet, people recognized it. They just recognized something that was in tune with their own nature. And so they were drawn to it. You know, how people feel about music, especially popular music. You sort of, it takes you somewhere, especially that kind of popular music. It just takes you somewhere that reinforces who you think you want to be on a certain level. And Swamiji's comment, which is extremely relevant to this, was his saying, realizing how that man was a success and how he was able to be a success, made Swami said, it just reinforces the idea that he is completely out of tune with the times. So then why is Swami incarnated? Why is he doing so much work? You know, he was always acting as if this next book was going to be a bestseller and that this music was going to be taken up all over the world, and you know, that this was finally going to be the book or the poem or the song that was just going to ignite the world. He always had that very positive affirmation, but it was more like he himself would say, it's like he's laying the foundation for the time when the world will suddenly turn to it. In the introduction to my book, Lightbearer, about Swamiji, the book I wrote, published this year, about, this year, 2019, I put into the introduction that Swami Kriyananda has created an entire alternate way of life, which is self-realization as a way of life. Not just like how to meditate, not just Kriya, but self-realization as a way of life. You know, money, relationships, educating children, art, material success. Just basically, if there's an area of life that is fundamental to human life, then he has picked it up from the thread of, let's assume self-realization is the goal. Let's assume Sanatana Dharma is the principle. Then how would you conduct yourself? And then he's written books about it. He's manifested through the communities. He's exemplified it. How would you say it? He's translated it into music. All of it, every bit of it. It's all right there. Emotional health, mental health, physical health. And very few people care. That's how I wrote in the introduction. Right now, nobody cares. Nobody much cares. But there will come a time when the alternative ways of living and being, whether for individuals or for society as a whole, that we'll just reach the inevitable cataclysmic end of living in a way that is not true, that is not truly happiness producing, and therefore is not in tune with truth. Has nothing to do with being a sect. It just means that, well, when we read last week, Westerners think that Hindus are idol worshippers, but what is it that Westerners themselves worship? And it's money and power. What could be a more disappointing idol in the end than something that is so fundamental to Maya? So sooner or later, and because this is a rising age and we are moving into a higher yuga, there will be a societal repudiation of these false idols in time. Definitely not now, but in time there will be. Eventually is what I mean by that. Not in time, because it might be too late by the time we repudiate them for many things, but eventually there will be a mass repudiation. But in the meantime, one individual at a time. You know, each of us has our own cataclysmic shift in which the world as we know it collapses. And it either happens in a dramatic outward way, or it happens in a very inward way. When I came to the spiritual path, when I came first to the principles of Sanatana Dharma and then a few years later to Swami himself, I was at a state of societal collapse within myself. It didn't show because I knew that it wouldn't help to actually have a nervous breakdown. I've described to you that I considered it, and I just realized it would be very expensive and time-consuming and exhausting. It was a past life memory of having tried that. And I just knew that in the end, it would be a perfect circle, and I would be standing at the cliff of meaninglessness that was nearly pushing me off into madness at that point. But I had just been there, done that, and I know what that story is, and I'm not going to do it again. So it was Thoreau's quiet desperation. Just like there was no society that I could imagine that I could join. And then when I met Swami Kriyananda, and not only, by then I knew about the principles, but he actually had a place. It's impossible to describe what that meant to me, that he had an actual place. And therefore I could pick up my physical body and I could take my body to a place. And that place was a new civilization. And it just was. It was a completely new civilization, especially then, because we were out in the woods. There was no electricity, there was no television, there was no internet, there was no radio, really, except some people had little battery radios, but why? There was no electric lights, there was no indoor plumbing. We were just out completely by ourselves without any connection to society as a whole. I mean, it wasn't that we never saw a newspaper or met another human being. It wasn't, unfortunately, like St. Anthony of the Desert. We had a retreat, we came out and gave classes from time to time, but our life was so separated from ordinary life. It didn't feel like even the slightest loss to me. I wasn't much for society as a whole. But it was a new civilization. And just like we were building something else. I had no idea. Swami knew what we were building, but I didn't. In fact, he said, I remember at one point, he said, I used to tell people what Ananda would become, but rather than inspiring them, I saw that it frightened them. He said, so I don't talk about it anymore. But nonetheless, there was a personal, total collapse of society within me. And then there was this society called self-realization, which is what he was there. And he would always tell us, often told us, that the day will come when Master's teachings will define society. He said, not necessarily Master's name. It was interesting. Not necessarily Master's name, but the teachings. You know, it will just become part of what we're doing. You know, I mean, diet is a very small part of things, but it's also an important part of things. Of course, meditation is more important. I came onto this path, onto the path of self-realization in 1966. June of 66 is when I heard about it. So, you know, that's like more than 50 years ago now. And when we started just being vegetarians, and when we started talking about whole grains, and we started talking about organic foods, and it was just like, I mean, what to speak of yoga and meditation, which was just way, way off the edge. I mean, we were considered so nuts, just completely crazy, like absolutely beyond the beyond. And now, you know, meditation is virtually mainstream. Not meditation for God realization. We haven't really gotten to there. But people will talk about meditation. Doctors will recommend meditation, you know, for high blood pressure, for heart disease, for all kinds of things. People will recommend meditation, and most people, I'm not going to talk about the least informed section of society, but a large swath of the forward-looking part of society. Meditation it's understood that if you can calm your mind, then that inner reality is fundamental. And that was just 50 years ago, that was completely unknown. There was just a very small handful of people knew that. Where did that come from? I mean, it came from the fact that these teachers from India have been coming, that they've been bringing this story, that everybody has read Autobiography of a Yogi. You go into virtually any setting where people are thinking in this direction, and you ask how many people have read Autobiography of a Yogi. It's like usually 95% of the room. And many, many people say that their journey into a new way of thinking began with Autobiography of a Yogi. Just all these individual people just reading this book. And one of the most influential innovators of our age was Steve Jobs. And famously, the only book he had on his iPad was Autobiography of a Yogi. And he said he read it every year. And little is known about what his inner life was like. But nonetheless, there it was, like this. And so you don't think of the iPhone as being part of Master's mission. But nonetheless, all of that, what that man did to tie the world together, to dissolve time and space with technology, to create an entirely new way for human beings to relate to each other, all of these things. And there he was, and he was in some way, he was an instrument of that. So what's happening is so different. And this is where Master uses the words, we are not a sect. A sect is, here is our teacher, he's the greatest teacher, we're his followers, and his followers, we're the ones, and you need to be his followers because that's what we're here doing. We are an expression of this particular line, and this is what we do. Now that doesn't mean that we aren't, followers of a particular line, and that doesn't mean that some of us don't have the only way I can call it is a very specifically designed mission. Within the walls of this temple and within the parameters of my responsibility, I was born to share Master's teachings the way I learned it from Swami. And that doesn't mean that there's not a whole lot of other really good things to do and that everybody has to follow my way, or that I'm even part of a sect or anything like that. It's just I was born to do that, so that's what I do. And this temple is representing that particular lineage, and so there's lots of other things that you could do, but when people come within these walls, this is what we represent. This is when Swamiji was, in the beginning, he had to work hard to persuade us to focus on his music in the way he knew it was important for us to do for various reasons. And he would try various ploys like, no one else is doing it. No one else is playing my music. So maybe it's something that we could do that would be unique. Later he became more definite about it. But the point was, and he actually phrased it perfectly, he said, this music is a new consciousness entering the world as music. And the way I've always thought about it is that music has a vibration, and that vibration is very closely aligned with the vibration of Master and his mission, and that music is a way to get in tune with that mission. And it's not like no other music could ever be or would ever be or is. It's not like there is no other music that's in tune with that vibration, but we need to be careful to use music that is in tune with that vibration, because music has such a powerful influence on our consciousness. And of course, Master himself wrote a lot of music, so we use it all, but it's the vibration we're seeking. And it's a little bit subtle, so it's better. I'm just going to finish a thought here. Someone was talking to me, reminded me of a discussion Swamiji had with a very talented and highly trained musician. This was decades ago. And that man wanted to write and sing the music that he himself wrote. And his music wasn't bad. It was nice. But Swami said this to him, and it wasn't received and it wasn't understood. But he said, if you would wait, and instead of writing and singing your own music, just sing my music for a while, he said, it will put you more in tune with yourself. He said, and then you will be able to write what he said would be original music, which is music that comes from your point of origin. He said, the music you write is nice, and it was and is, but it's imitative, is the word he used. He said, because you're hearing it around you, and then you're just translating it and saying it. It's not springing from your own unique inspiration, which is what you really have. But if you use the music that Swami had written to get more in tune with that consciousness that it represented, then you will spontaneously be able to be original in the music you write. It was very interesting advice, and that's the whole story about attunement. That's what attunement is about. And it gets complicated for creative people because they want to express themselves. They want to, and there is this sort of, that same person said to Swami, tried to plead with Swamiji to support his artistic inclinations by saying, you know how it is, he said to Swami, you know how it is. Sometimes you just have to express yourself. And Swami said, no, I don't. I've never expressed myself. He said, everything I've done, he said, I've done to serve Master because Master inspired me to do it. I've never expressed myself, he said. Now, of course, Swami is like, he comes from another order of magnitude. When I was having trouble writing, and I said something about writer's block, Swami said, I've never had writer's block. Just like that, never. He said, never. I thought, oh, wow, my God, what that must be like to just be so free, that you just tune in and do it. By no means would I say that I don't have writer's block, but I will say that I've traveled the distance of from here to the sun to get over it. I began to understand what was going on with all of that, which was exactly what Swami was saying. I was so busy expressing myself, I couldn't express anything at all. You have to stand back a little bit. But in any case, so let me go back to wherever we were here. What were we saying? Oh, this was where, so I was talking about the way these things actually grow and develop. And so Master then comes and Master says, this is a special dispensation. I said to Swami, because he wrote a little brochure in the early 80s, it was called A New Dispensation, he called it then. Master's mission is a new dispensation. Dispensation, that word means like what? A new gift, a new special offering, a special doorway, a special dispensation. I said, Swamiji, does that mean that we get more than we've actually earned? Because I'm like, that seems contrary to karmic law. He said, in a sense, yes. I thought that was very interesting. In a sense, yes. Now, Swami wrote it in the little brochure called A New Dispensation. He talked about how when enough people call strongly enough, it creates a magnetic field which draws down a divine incarnation, literally. A prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. There's certain longing of certain people or people as a whole. Jesus was born into the Essene community, which was the Sanatan Dharma remnant of Judaism, which was a true religion but had been corrupted. Jesus appears to the great master Babaji and he said, my people are still doing good works, but they've forgotten inner communion. They need me. We have to go back. We have to do something to remind them of what it is that I really taught. So Master comes, and Hinduism also, but Hinduism is quite something else because Sanatan Dharma in India just has always been there. But Krishna's teachings too have become lost in a tree that needs pruning, as Swami says. So a special dispensation is when a great force of light comes. And I guess you might think of it this way, that the light is so bright that you don't have to have really, really good vision to see it. Whereas sometimes the light would be a little hard to see and you'd have to really seek it out. Just like when Lahiri Mahashaya was drawn up to the Himalayas and met Babaji again, he gets Kriya. Lahiri thinks, forget the family, forget the job, I'm never going back. I found my guru again, why would I ever go back to the life I had? He just assumes he's going to stay there. I mean, Babaji has his little blanket and his water pot that he's kept polished all this time, and he shows it to him. So Lahiri naturally imagines, insofar as the Leela plays itself out, that he's just going to get to sit on his asana and use his little water pot again. Why would Babaji have saved it for him otherwise? And the office and everything else is just beyond being a dream. It just doesn't even exist. The visionary, one of the visionaries in Medjugorje who wrote the beautiful biography called My Heart Will Triumph, which is the words of Mary to her, not her words. Mary saying, my heart will triumph. It's a beautiful book. It's a first-hand account of one of the visionaries in Medjugorje, of Mother Mary. And she saw Mary every day for a long time, and now, I mean, it's been going on for 30 years. Now she sees her once a month, I believe. And then also maybe on her birthday, but about once a month. Once a week, once a month, I'm not sure. But whatever it is, she says she's a mother, she has a family. She was speaking to this other man who had 9 children as it happened. She was trying to explain to him what happens to her when Mary comes to her. She says to this man, you know, you have children, you know, you never forget your children. And they both agreed, you never forget your children. She said, when I'm with Mary, I forget my children. She said they just don't exist, because nothing exists except the purity of her presence in that light. There's no reality, no material, no limited reality can exist in that vibration. As soon as she comes out of it, she remembers her children. And she also talked about it's a little traumatic. She says she usually weeps a lot. I mean, this happens regularly, whether it's once a week or once a month, but the transition back into this world is not always an easy one, because she has to, I mean, she loves her life, but still the transition out of that realm. So when the Lahiri is there with Babaji, it's not merely that he's a disinclination, it doesn't exist. And yet, what Lahiri says, so then Babaji says, no, you have to go back and you have to teach people Kriya. And then Babaji says to him, you must give Kriya, you can only give Kriya to those who are willing to renounce everything for God. And Lahiri says basically, well then I guess I won't be initiating very many people. I'm not going to be very busy, I might as well stay here with you. I mean, that's not exactly how he puts it, but that's implied. And then Lahiri says, but there's so many who could benefit, who can't take that step. It's just beyond them. So Babaji says, God has spoken through you. See, that's the beginning of it being a special dispensation. Whereas this had been a technique that was reserved for those who had that kind of karmic commitment. But Lahiri says, no, we need to give this to everyone because it's a special dispensation. Meaning that out of the mercy of God, out of the need, because we're transitioning from one yuga to another, in order to establish this new work. I mean, these are all just, I'm saying things because I don't know. I never heard Swamiji exactly say why. You have 5 avatars lined up together, coming in, and it has to do with shifting the yuga into a higher one, putting all that power and magnetism behind it, so that even the dimmest among us will be able to see the light. So we do get a little more than we would get otherwise. So here, this young man, in this particular story, he's just receptive enough to go into a realm where Master is vibrating. That's the only thing you can think of, that he himself was able to lift his consciousness into something like that. There's no mention made about his own state of spiritual realization, but there must have been something. It's an odd story. And Swami himself admits that it's an unusual story, but it was provided so that Master could make that statement. It's not like everybody who's going to be uplifted it has to become my disciple. We are not a sect. I'm not here to establish another Catholic Church. I mean, that's actually was a point of dispute between Dayamata and Swami Kriyananda, because Master said, self-realization has come to unite all religions. And Swamiji understood that to mean, and he was absolutely certain of his interpretation, that means the principle of self-realization is the unifying reality behind all religions. Sanatana Dharma, in other words, every religion ultimately leads to a transformation of inner consciousness and leads to an upliftment of that consciousness. And as Patanjali writes in his sutras and the Eightfold Path, these are the things that happen to you, and this happens to everyone. This was so interesting to us when we were in Israel. There we were on our own, really, we were neither Christians nor Jews in that environment. We were just our own Sanatana Dharma version as we learned it from Master. And all around us, Judaism was being practiced in sometimes some very rigid forms. I mean, especially in Jerusalem, you have all these people who are wearing these clothes that are from a different era. Especially there are these men in these big fur hats. And their world makes perfect sense to them. And they wear black and white, and they wear these, some of them wear the fedora sort of hats. Young boys, everybody wears them. And then some of them wear these big fur hats. I mean, it's all very exact, and people wear yarmulkes and different style of yarmulkes and different colors of yarmulkes mean different things. Just all of this, very exact. And some of it was very inspiring, but all of it was a little hard for us to understand. And the 600 and something laws of the Torah that you have to follow and all these things like this. So we were running in parallel tracks until we met this man whose name I can't remember, who was a student of the Kabbalah, of the mystical branch of Judaism, and we were absolutely a one-minded spirit. We were just completely the same. We couldn't have been more different if you'd actually asked about it, but we were also exactly the same. We recognized each other. As soon as we started talking about the way of belief, as Swami calls it, the way of awakening, Swami wrote the book, Hindu Way of Awakening. The way of awakening is where self-realization, the principles unite all religions. The way of belief takes you to places where you could never reconcile it, like that. So Swamiji was absolutely certain that Master's statement meant that the principles are what count, not the specific form of it. Dayamata, who was then president of Self-Realization Fellowship, actually was asserted, this is a conversation that I was present for, asserted that Master meant that Self-Realization Fellowship is going to be the Catholic Church of the New Age. Swami said to her, in so many words, really? But really is what she felt. She just saw just one more way like that. Swami, that was why we were at such odds with them, because Swami Kriyananda had been expelled from SRF and then continued to represent the teaching. And according to their understanding, that wasn't possible because the teaching and the institution were the same reality, and it simply wasn't possible for a valid expression of that teaching to exist outside of the institution. Swami's response again was, really? And that's sort of where it was left, because both of them are off the planet at this point. But Master said, we are not a sect. We are not here to create a giant, worldwide, controlling institution of the future. We are here to awaken people to their own reality. Now, naturally, a lot of people will draw their inspiration from these masters. There's a huge force in the world that we don't know as much about, which is all the people who follow Babaji. There's just this huge movement of people who are disciples of Babaji and who don't necessarily follow through Master, through Swami. They feel that Babaji directly is guiding them, and why not? And why not? And then there's, of course, all those people who are devoted to Christ, and why not? Because the true devotees of every path recognize each other, just as that wonderful Kabbalist man. We just recognized each other. We just walked into the room, and he recognized us, and we recognized him. We had a little love feast, and bought a fortune of his art. Probably made his year buying so much of his art. Yeah, and it was just splendid. And afterwards, it was very interesting because our guide, a very fine fellow who follows a conservative, modern conservative is what he calls it. Modern conservative? That doesn't make sense. Say again? Modern Orthodox, that's the right word. So he's not as narrow as some, but he's still very definite about his way of his practices and so on. And wonderful man, I totally respect him. After we met the man who studied the Kabbalah, our conversations about Judaism became very simple because I just repeated what that man had said and said us too. And it worked all the way around. It just had to be the right articulation. Because that's what it really is. The Master says you should be loyal to the path that God draws you to. That doesn't mean that you have to be loyal to the path you were born into. But it doesn't. It just because he had a vision of Master doesn't mean he should abandon his path. You know, it's a blessing, but it's not necessarily a sign that you should do something else. And everybody doesn't have to become his disciple. That's as simple as what he's saying. Did you have a comment or no?
No, his name is Abraham.
Abraham, that's right. The man, Abraham something. Can someone tell me his last name? No. He did, I wish I have to find out, and next week I'll know. He translated the Kabbalah into English. It's absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. It's just aspects, I'm so ignorant. I'm not even entirely sure what the Kabbalah is, like how big a book it is or how much of it he translated, that's what I mean. I know it's the traditional mystical, but he had multiple volumes and they were just beautiful. Very magnetic, very strong, very clear. There was no reason in the world why he should follow our path. It would just be absurd for him. He's doing exactly what he should be doing. Sort of when you see it like that, oh, this is working for you. Why would you need to be ours when this is taking you where you need to go? You see, that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about people refusing to follow a path because they don't want to, or because they don't, how would I put it? Because they're not willing to do the work, or they're not ready to really be serious, and using excuses to avoid that. I don't mean, it's perfectly fine, people shouldn't follow a path unless they feel inspired to, but sometimes people rationalize and justify their position. But there's no reason in the world why everyone should be Master's disciple, because what a small world that would be. But everybody is a self-realizationist, whether they know it or not. Because Sanatana Dharma, it's sometimes translated as eternal religion, but another translation is that which is. That's my favorite. It's just that which is. It's the way the human being is made, and it's the principles that describe how the human being finds happiness, and how the human being avoids suffering. And Master's first book when he came to America was The Science of Religion. And Swamiji rewrote, the book was ghost-written for Master by a disciple named Yogananda. So Swami ghost-wrote it again and called it God is for Everyone. He wanted to publish it as by Paramhansa Yogananda, but we were told through various attorneys that wasn't going to fly. So he had to put his name on it as author, but he did something did something so that Master was almost the author, but he still had to put his own name on it. But very simple principles. Everyone wants to avoid suffering. Everyone wants to magnify their happiness. Period. That's how Master came to America. He took the whole of Hinduism, the whole of the Sanatana Dharma tradition, and he reduced it to those two principles. Everybody wants to avoid suffering. Everybody wants to increase happiness. And everybody will eventually discover that there are principles that reduce suffering, and there are principles that increase happiness. It isn't just, divine principles, eternal principles is the word we want to use. Just, there are realities as to the way we are made. And we can rebel against them. We can be angry about them. We can do anything we want, but it just doesn't make us different than we are. We just are what we are. And we do try. We just experiment with every possible thing. But then there's a special dispensation which comes, which enlightens a lot of people The light is very bright, and you just or notice something that you wouldn't quite have noticed, except that this magnificent, compassionate force has come in to help us. I mean, I don't know, I'm sure we always feel this way, but I certainly feel rescued through no particular virtue of my own, but just
You felt rescued?
rescued.
I
Oh,
feel the same way.
yeah, yeah. The word, Edna was saying that she feels just the same way. I was talking to someone and I was saying my phrase is, if it wasn't for Swami, I'd just be dead in a ditch somewhere. Yeah, just like I'd feel like that, whether I was actually literally dead in a ditch, I would just be dead in a ditch. I mean, like, what would I have done if he hadn't come and rescued me? If he hadn't incarnated and come and gotten me? And if Master hadn't come and gotten him? You know, it's just like, what would I have done with myself? The special dispensation doesn't have anything. I mean, I recognize that I'm serious about the path, and I recognize that I'm not interested in a lot of things that a lot of people are interested in anymore, you know. But still, it's still a miracle. It's an absolute miracle. Yeah, it's a special dispensation. Well, so let me just see what a little bit more here. And so, you know, Master himself downplayed his own role. Something that we don't really get that much of is that he constantly referenced what he was doing to both Sri Yukteswar and Babaji. And part of the strong emphasis on him as the force actually came after he died, as it became more institutionalized. You know, even to, well, we have this cross here, but to rearrange the pictures, Master put his own picture at the end, and then SRF put him a little closer to the center. I'm not sure why, but they did. This arrangement that we have on our altar with the cross sort of avoids the whole question. It's just different. Master arranged the pictures in a cross as we have them, and also in a line. When we put them in a line, we put Master at the end, but they moved Master in a little closer. I don't know why. But there's institutionally, this emphasis gets placed on the founder or the guru, however you want to say it. Whereas when Master was living, and if you listen to him, he always talks about our guru preceptors. He always talks about our line of gurus, and he always had us all pray to all of them. It was just part of the way it was. So when he would say, "I'm just a bulge on the ocean," he was just speaking. I'm just part of this flow of energy. I'm not the definition of this flow of energy. He exemplifies it. And for the disciple, the relationship is entirely different. But it's a personal relationship, which countless, limitless numbers of people can have. Everybody can have it. But for each one, it's completely personal. So there is that. I heard Swami talking on Master's birthday. It was Master's centennial, 93 year. He said, he was trying to explain, he said, I'm going to be talking about Master tonight. He was expressing the context. He said, and I can't remember his exact words, but this was the meaning of it. He said, it may sound like I think that Master is the greatest, he said, of all masters. And he said, and to me he is. Of course he is. But that doesn't mean that there's no one like him or that you can't feel that way. But as a disciple, I naturally feel that. But that's not why I follow him. I don't follow him because I lined them all up and I thought this was, this is a 7, this is a 9, and this is a 10. I follow him because he's mine, which is completely different. So there's just so many, they're all in this, there's so many nuances here. And then he says, whenever you see God in any form, don't mistake infinity for the form. Just look to God through it. They're all equal. And it's just such a generous and beautiful way to look at it. So much better. Well, let's take a little break and then see if there's any questions before we go on. All right, I was asked a question during the break, which I would like to elucidate a little, explain a little more because it's very important. It was in reference to that story I was telling about how Master had advised the young musician that if he listened to Swami's music, he'd get more in tune with himself. And so the question was brought up, well, I've always thought about the music. Swami's music is you get in tune with him. He says himself, if you want to get to know me, listen to my music. And so that's, that sort of tells you, well, then that's his. And he's also said in other places, however, it's not my music. It's the music that's come through me. I've never considered it mine. An interviewer asked him once, what's your favorite music? And Swami said, mine. And then he sort of realized that sounded a little funny. And he said, I don't consider it my music, it's the music that's come through me. But he said, it has come through me, so it has a certain resonance, with my own temperament. But he's always just felt, and this is where he said later toward the end of his life, that it's a new consciousness that has come as music, which is such an interesting way to put it. I'm going to digress with that thought for a minute. This is from a novel called The House of Fulfillment. Now, I can't remember the name of the woman who wrote the book, but she wrote under several pseudonyms, and she wrote spiritual novels. This was a lovely book. I read a few other of her books, and this one, there were English people who traveled in India. This book was written quite decades ago, maybe even a century ago, I'm not sure. Indian people traveling in India, meeting masters, the British, most of the British went to India to be British, but some British went to India to take what India really had. So this was one of those stories. And in the course of the story, there's this one character who spends a long time with the guru way up in the mountains, in the mount of the Himalayas. And she reaches a very high state of realization, but she knows from her master, this is all fiction, but it's truth also. She knows from her master that she's not going to be able to stay in the Himalayas, that she has a mission to the world. And she's reached the state of consciousness now where she can be a real instrument. And for a while, she doesn't know what form that vibration is going to take. And part of the story is they're all artists. Will she be a singer? Will she be a poet? Will she be a novelist? Will she be a painter? And she could see from where she was standing that what she would bring is the vibration, and she could take any one of those forms, and it wouldn't matter. It was the vibration that she was going to bring. And in the story, she becomes a sculptor. And she's world famous, but nobody knows who she really is because she keeps herself hidden, but her work is famous. So that's the interesting story. So when Swamiji talks about this is a consciousness that comes into the world as music, I thought about that novel where the consciousness was there first, and then what form, how will it manifest into this world? I don't know if it was last week when I was talking about how I toward the end of Swami's life, I was talking about a specific experience where he was talking in this temple as it happened here in Palo Alto. And for some reason I was extremely aware that night that all he was presenting was vibration, and he was just putting words on it so that we would have some way of receiving the vibration. And the words made sense and they were charming sometimes, and we laughed and we learned. But I was conscious of the fact that the words were not at all what he was giving us. And therefore the ideas that he was giving us were just not what he was giving us. What he was giving us was a vibration, and then we would bring it down to the level of ideas. But the vibration, what was coming first. He himself said, whenever in fact this was instructions to us, concentrate first on the vibration. And then he also talked about filling the room with your vibrations, because that's what really has an effect on people. The first time I heard Swami speak, I was in the last row. It wasn't that large a room, but I was in the very last row of bleachers of all things, which was actually nice because there was nothing visual between me and seeing him, because I was up high and everybody's, tiered downward. But I felt that he was about an inch in front of me. And on another occasion, this time we were at the Hall of Flowers in Golden Gate Park, and that room held about 700 or 800. It was quite a large room. And because I wasn't exactly crew, but I wasn't exactly audience either. And I took a seat against the back wall, sort of on some packing crates. I wasn't even like sitting in the chairs. And I was leaning against the back wall of this very large hall, and he was speaking. And he was so present, close to me, and I was so dumb. The first thing I thought of, wow, this is a great sound system. And I sat with that thought for longer than you might expect before it occurred to me that it wasn't the sound system. He had filled the hall with his magnetism, and I was against the back wall, and it was as present as if we were having tea across a table like this. Now, but coming back to what I'm talking about, the question is, what does it mean to be in tune with Master? What does it mean to be in tune with Swami? What does it mean to be, well, in tune at all? I was going to say in tune with God, but that actually partially answers the question. Let me see now. When Swami was telling that young man, if you listen to my music, you'll get more in tune with yourself, which is meaning that this music will help you escape from your ego hypnosis. And that's what we're trying to do. To get in tune with ourselves it is our point of origin, because in that context he was using his definition of originality in creative art, which is that it springs from your point of origin. It's not imitative. You're not just looking around and shifting John Denver's lyrics a little, or Bob Dylan's, or whoever it is now. No, I'm sure those are so passé that it just dates me like nothing. But anyway, you're not just shifting those a little bit, you're actually having a completely new inspiration. And Swami often said that a new inspiration, an original inspiration, is not necessarily that different. It just vibrates with authenticity. And he would use the example of the words, "I love you." He said, what could be more of a cliche? There's just hardly a phrase that's more of a cliche. But when you really mean it, it vibrates with this power that, many more elaborate words could never give, because it's authentically original. It's coming from your point of origin when you really mean it in the way that those words can mean. So when he said, if you listen to my music, you'll get in tune with yourself. You'll get deeper in yourself, because the vibration of that music, specifically, since we're talking about it, the vibration of that music is to take you out of your ego. And then when you get out of your ego, what you enter into is you enter into the great ocean of spirit. So when we get in tune with Master, this is why when that phrase, when Master said, I'm just a bulge on the ocean, speaking of himself, it happened, if I'm correct, when Swami was sitting there thinking how wonderful Master was. He was just in his presence, and he was thinking, I'm so fortunate to be his disciple. He's such a magnificent guru, just all of these things. I mean, that we're directing himself not inappropriately. The guru bhakti, the devotion to the guru that Swami felt was not inappropriate. But Master wanted to tell him what it really meant, what he was really getting in tune with. I'm just a bulge on the ocean. And this is the end of this one. When you see any form of God in vision, Master said, behold in those eyes the consciousness of infinity. It is a mistake to limit God to any form, to any definition, to any one religion. So when you get in tune with someone who's in tune with God, you get in tune with God. And when you get in tune with God, you get in tune with yourself. So anything that helps you in that direction. I mean, that's how I know I was trying to talk about, I think it was in here last week or the week before, just that I have this, the window through which the divine speaks to me has always been Swami Kriyananda. And in the early days of Ananda, and even somebody brought this up recently, I haven't heard this in such a long time, I'd forgotten about it. Who is really the guru? Swami Kriyananda is too much of the guru, Master is the guru. And okay, I remember all that from years ago. And when we were very at the beginning of Ananda, especially partly because, well, there were a lot of reasons, and I'll articulate them. I put all this in light bare. But since there's 220,000 words in the book, you might not remember them all. But in any case, Swami himself said, because of the extremely harsh way in which he was separated from SRF, and the force with which his gurubhais pushed him away and tried to destroy his faith in his own discipleship and destroy his faith in himself, Swamiji, for a long time, as he put it, he was very concerned lest any part of their accusations prove true. I mean, in himself, on one level, he knew who he was, he knew who Master was to him, he knew what he was supposed to do and all of that. But all of the people that he had respected, all of his gurubhais, turned against him and denigrated him, and actually systematically and consistently for Swami's entire life tried to undermine Swami's confidence, credibility as a disciple. So Swami wanted to be particularly careful never to accidentally draw people to himself. So he was very, very strong about not asserting himself. Nonetheless, magnetism is magnetism. I actually finally figured out with Ananda, people have position, especially as we've gotten a little more organized. But Ananda runs on who's willing to take responsibility and who has magnetism. And it really doesn't run on you're the president, you're the vice president, you're in charge of this, you're in charge of that, you're the spiritual director, you're that. I have observed that Ananda people will find a way to go around you if they don't. If you're willing to take responsibility, then you have a certain reality within Ananda, and if you have a genuine magnetism. And magnetism comes in many forms, just magnetism of love, magnetism of kindness. It doesn't have to be magnetism of tremendous charismatic personality, but if you have magnetism, which is your genuine consciousness, then you have influence, you have the opportunity, and everybody responds to you accordingly. You can put any title you want on your t-shirt and nobody will pay attention to it unless you have magnetism and are willing to take responsibility. Both of those things are vital. So Swami had magnetism. There was just no way around it. He was the doorway for a lot of us. That's how I came to know Master. And people would sort of, are you following Swami? Are you following Master? Are you in tune with Swami? Are you in tune with Master? And this is how I would often say it to people, because you actually had to say these things in those days. I said, the difference between Swami and Master is not obvious to me. The difference between me and Swami is real obvious to me. So I'm going to sort of bridge that gap first, and then I'll worry about the one that comes after it. Because I knew that Swami was the window, but it was because he was a window onto where we were all trying to go. And if I lived my life the way he guided me and the way he tried to live his, then I could be in tune with what he was in tune with, which he was in tune with Master, and through Master he was in tune with the divine. And that's who we all are. So when you're talking about these things, that's where you're really trying to go. We're trying to go to the part where not only the personality and the form of the Masters disappear, but ours disappears, which is really what this whole thing is about. I mean, if we get too fixated on them, then by extension we end up too fixated on ourselves, because we've got the whole thing mixed up. That's certainly, going back to the music, that's certainly been my experience when that music really, I've been listening to Swami's, there's 400 pieces of music, but over 50 years, that's, you still hear them all a lot. I'm amazed how every so often I'll hear something I don't recognize, but almost every time when I hear it, I know the melody, and I know many or most of the words, but I can just sing those songs over and over and over again. Of course, when we were in Israel and we were singing the songs from the oratorio, which was the life of Christ, every time we'd sing it, they'd sing the same song every day. And every day it had the same power to shift consciousness. And I learned something new. I learned something new from the words or the melody that I didn't know the day before. And then we sang lots of others of Swami songs, and every time we sang it, I would learn something new. Because it's a consciousness. It's a new consciousness, and consciousness is ever new. The definition of it is it's not the same today as it was yesterday, because it's an ever existing, ever newly creative, and it's always in the moment. And it's not based on the past. So that consciousness has taken the form of Paramahansa Yogananda, Babaji, Jesus, Kriyananda, a song, a painting, whatever, a poem, whatever it might be. Master says about whispers from eternity, he exhorts the reader to penetrate beyond ink and paper. I just love that. For some reason, I always think about chewing on the paper. Don't ask me why, but just like to get from the paper, to absorb from the paper. There was a very funny little vignette that was being passed around. Some little boy really loved a book by Martin, one of a very famous Salendecker, can't say his name properly, but he's a very famous children's author. So the little boy wrote a note, and then the author wrote back and sent the little boy a picture, which would have been worth a huge amount of money. And the boy was so excited he ate it. Because he just wanted to absorb it into himself. So he took this priceless, unique piece of art and then ate it. I loved it. But Maurice Sendak. Yeah, that's his name. Maurice Sendak. But I don't even know if it's a true story, but it's an absolutely charming story. I'm going to just digress this little bit over here. This woman, a friend of mine, was pregnant with her second child, and her first child was only 2 years old. And she was a little concerned about sibling rivalry and the first baby being replaced by the second baby and all of this. So she's driving down the highway, and her little child is there, and they're talking. I feel like the conversation happened in the car, but it doesn't matter. And the little child says to Mommy, "Mommy, when the baby's born, I'm going to eat him." And the mother thinks, "Oh no, this is just terrible." But she's able to stay calm enough. "Why, honey, would you want to eat your little brother? So that then he can be in my tummy like he's in yours." Just the child's brain is completely different than the adult brain. So, the mother is greatly relieved. But what I was saying, where I started, was Master talking about penetrating beyond ink and paper. And then I can't remember the phrase he uses, but it's basically to the living presence of God, which is contained in the whispers, meaning in the poems, which are answered prayers. And if you tune in deeply enough to those poems and prayers, they will take you to the origin point of those prayers, which was Master's attunement to God. But when you're there, you're not in his attunement, you're in your attunement. And so that's what's happening. When you're in that attunement, it's your attunement. That's the very definition of it. Because if it's his attunement, you're not there. That is the way of belief. That is the way of ritual. That's not the way of experience. The way of experience is what they have, you have. This ye shall do in greater things, Jesus said. Be therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Why do you call me Master? Aren't you too also gods? Yes, that's what attunement is. We realize that what they are, we are. But it's easier to get there, by following Swami's footprints in the ether, as I have tried to do my whole life. I've step by step begun to understand more of what it is to be in tune. And then when it's my turn, I have a better idea how to do it, because it was personified. And of course, there's a whole other subtle level of grace, which is what this whole evening's been about, the special dispensation. That this power is there and that you can find it. You can find your way because the light is so bright. The Om is so strong that it's harder to get lost than it would be otherwise. All right?
Thank you.
Okay, that's it for tonight. So I did 1, which was 4, 4, 6.